My name is Stephanie Yuhl, and I'm in the history department who is co-sponsoring this event along with English and Africana Studies. And I'm really excited today for this conversation. There's some seats up here, KJ, too, I think, in the nook, if anybody wants them. This event called Accounting for History, Race, Slavery, and Institutional Memory. I'm really happy that our two guests, Deborah Gray White and Robert Patterson, are here, and they're going to be sharing with us some of their expertise around these questions at their institutions. But I'm going to wait a minute before I introduce them, just to frame what this session is about today. We're looking at this session as an opportunity, as a conversation about the moral imperative of reckoning with difficult histories, right? With the question of what stories are told and what stories aren't told, and how does these histories and these silences shape and reflect the way our community interacts, our values, our goal, and our mission. This is really an imperative central question of the discipline of history, and it's very relevant to our conversation today. So we decided that before I introduce our speakers, that I should provide a few words of background, explaining a bit about how the questions that we're going to consider today relate to Holy Cross's particular institutional history, in particular in relation to the history of enslavement. This is a story some of you may know about, depending on how long you've been part of this community, and for others it might be a new story, so we decided it would be good to sort of get everyone sort of on the same page in terms of some knowledge in a very brief way. In recent years, many institutions of higher education have been confronting the uglier and more difficult aspects of their pasts, from enslavement, exploitation, dislocation of indigenous peoples, and racism, just to name a few. And folks have been searching for meaningful and justice-oriented ways to reckon with the legacies of those processes in the present. So it's not just about how we tell the stories, but the ways in which the legacies of those stories and the telling of those stories shape who we are today, right, and the kind of community we are and want to be. And Holy Cross is part of this national conversation because we have our own connections to the history of enslavement. So I just want to sketch that out for you briefly. First, in the person of Thomas Mulady, who was the Jesuit priest of Georgetown University, oversaw in 1838 the sale of 272 enslaved persons, then owned by the Jesuits of Maryland. Thomas Mulady became the first president of Holy Cross in November of 1843. And likewise, until the end of the Civil War, Holy Cross graduates received Georgetown diplomas because the Commonwealth of Massachusetts would not grant this institution a charter because of anti-Catholicism and nativism. So for several decades, the graduates of this institution were receiving Georgetown degrees. So we're intimately tied up with Georgetown's story. But we have an even more explicit and in some ways more complex connection to the history of enslavement through the lives of the Healy brothers, particularly James and Patrick. These African-American men were born into enslavement in Georgia. Their mother was Eliza Clark, a woman enslaved by their father, Michael Healy. Michael Healy, who owned 49 slaves on his plantation, sent James, Patrick, and their siblings born to Eliza to the north to be educated. In 1844, James, Patrick, and their brother Hugh arrived here at Holy Cross, were baptized and educated by the Jesuits. As historian and Healy biographer James O'Toole notes, the Healy brothers, he argues, would use religion to confirm a white identity. Even before their conversion, they had many reasons to reject the blackness of their mother, but their entrance into Catholicism solidified that decision. James, who became the eventual bishop of Portland, Maine, was Holy Cross's first valedictorian. And today, Holy Cross identifies James as, correctly, African American, but at the time, Healy was, as O'Toole, his biographer explains, passing for white. James is a particularly complex figure. Himself born into slavery, he was against abolition. He called William Lloyd Garrison, the radical abolitionist, a fool, and was critical of radical Reconstruction policies after the Civil War that pushed for African American equality, citizenship, and civil rights. In 1962, Healy Hall, named after James Hall, opened at Holy Cross as a residence hall, and it remains named Healy Hall. In 1966, the college opened Mulady Hall, named after Thomas Mulady. On the recommendation of the Mulady-Healy Legacy Committee, convened by President Burroughs, who's here today. Phil, it's good to see you, thank you. Convened by Phil at Burroughs in 2015-16 to explicitly consider the legacy of these men and their connections to Holy Cross history. Father Burroughs, with the Board of Trustees' approval, renamed the residence hall Brooks Mulady, adding an honorific in recognition of John Brooks, a Jesuit who was instrumental, and one-time president as well, in integrating Holy Cross, integrating racially the student body and in the late 1960s, and also ushering in coeducation in the early 70s. Look at the crowd. This is so great. There might be some more room, but don't be shy. There might be some more room on the side.
Chairs up here.
And there's some chairs up here because we're really having a conversation. So feel free to sit back here if you want. Honestly, this is a great turnout. I love seeing the community so interested in these questions. This is great. And finally, we come to Patrick Healy, James Healy's brother, who also graduated from Holy Cross. He became a Jesuit, and he was the eventual president of Georgetown. And in fact, Georgetown University, my alma mater, still has a building named after Patrick Healy. Patrick brings us another twist in Holy Cross's relationship to the American institution of slavery. In 1850, Patrick and James's father, Michael, died. His estate, which included enslaved persons who were sold to make up the estate's assets, was valued at $50,000 in 1850, which is about $750,000 in today's dollars. Patrick Healy inherited $2,300 from this estate, which is about $75,000 today. In 1854, Patrick Healy was a young Jesuit, and he was teaching at Holy Cross, and he donated his inheritance, because he himself couldn't inherit it, to, in particular, a campaign to rebuild Fenwick Hall. Fenwick Hall had been pretty much destroyed by a fire in 1852, and there was a question after the Fenwick fire of would Holy Cross survive? It was a really young school. It was 9 years old at the time. Would this experiment in Worcester among the Jesuits to educate young Catholic men survive? And in fact, the rebuilding of Fenwick Hall, of which Patrick's donation was a part of the financing, was essential to the survival of Holy Cross and to the institution that we've become. And so it's there that we see in this example how Holy Cross benefited directly from the sale of enslaved persons through his father's the liquidation of his father's plantation. Okay? So where are we at Holy Cross in relation to reckoning with this history? Earlier this fall, President Burroughs spoke to the faculty at a faculty assembly about the college's plans to, in his words, continue our reflections on how we acknowledge the college's connections to the sin of slavery through Fathers Milady and Healy, and how this reality calls us to further our on-campus efforts at racial reconciliation within this community. With this in mind, the provost has convened a committee to move forward on the recommendations of the Milady-Healy Legacy and Educational Resource Committees. There have been 2 committees over the past years doing this work. And this new group of faculty and staff, including colleagues from marketing and communications, are going to do several things that have been recommendations from the reports, including they're right now updating the college's institutional history on our website, working on the language for a plaque to be placed to contextualize why Brooks Milady is called Brooks Milady and about that history. And to make recommendations about how we might tell our story to internal and external audiences, because those are 2 different kinds of charges there, right? And also to reflect in particular on how our story contributes to the larger dialogue that's going on about institutional histories, particularly histories about slavery. But most importantly for our conversation today, this committee is going to suggest active strategies for education and for action that might further our work to create an inclusive community at Holy Cross. So action steps that are going to make an impact in a meaningful way here at Holy Cross. And that's why it makes me really happy to see all of you members of the community here caring about these questions. So this is also what the faculty of the co-sponsors of today's event, the Department of History, thank you, Peace and Conflict Studies, thank you, and Africana Studies, also hope for. And that's why we brought these 2 distinguished colleagues and scholars to campus, so that we can learn from their experiences as we move forward in accounting for our history. So let me now introduce our speakers. They're going to speak, I think, from the table here, because we have microphones. Do you want to come up? So that you can all see, okay? And you know the order? Who wants to go first? What do you think? Want to do Georgetown, then Rutgers, or Rutgers, then Georgetown? You decide. In the meantime, I will introduce our esteemed colleagues. Deborah Gray White is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. In addition to teaching at Rutgers, Professor White currently heads the Scarlet and Black Project, which investigates Native Americans and African Americans in the history of Rutgers University. With Professor Marisa Fuentes, she is editor of the 2016 volume Scarlet and Black, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History. Among her many books and publications, she is the author of the germinal book, Aren't I a Woman? Female Slaves in the Plantation South. And I have to just say, about 20 minutes ago after having lunch and being colleagues. I had a total fangirl moment when I said, okay, I read your book as an undergrad, and she said, the blue one, the blue cover? I'm like, the original, the blue one. And she really shaped her work as a pioneer in looking at slavery from the perspective of women's experiences on the ground. It was just earth-shattering for the historiography and really helped to shape my own growth as an historian. So I'm thrilled that Deborah is with us. She's also the author of Too Heavy a Load, Black Women in Defense of Themselves, 1894 to 1994, Let My People Go, African Americans, 1804 to 1860, and Lost in the USA, most recently, American Identity, From the Promise Keepers to the Million Mom March, University of Illinois, just came out last year. Robert Patterson is an associate professor of African American Studies and chair of the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University. At Georgetown, he co-chaired the president's Racial Justice Working Group, which led the efforts to form the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University, and the Georgetown University Racial Justice Institute. He is the author of Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues and the Politics of Racial Equality, Exodus Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture, and he is the editor of Black Culture Production After Civil Rights and co-editor of The Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Culture. Both of these scholars are here not just because they're excellent scholars, but because they have on-the-ground experience at their institutions, which are both northern institutions, with trying to untangle this process of how does an institution try to do meaningful work in relation to the stories of their past in the present. And so we really are looking at this almost as a workshop and as an opportunity to learn from you as the committee that's just been convened moves forward with our own history in relation to this question. So please join me in welcoming Robert Patterson and Deborah Gray White. Thank you.
Ladies first. Good afternoon.
I'll get myself. I'll keep you talking.
So, on September 1749, the slave ship Wolf left New York City for Africa, where it would troll the West Coast, eventually buying and imprisoning 147 Africans, most of whom were children. Before it returned to New York in May of 1751, with its human cargo packed like sardines in its hold, it had littered the Atlantic Ocean with 81 dead black bodies. Again, most of them children. They had succumbed to the vessel's diseased environment, particularly the conditions that allowed 12 to 13-inch worms to incubate the stomachs and intestines of its youthful captives. On May 21st, the surviving 66 were auctioned off for sale by Philip Livingston, the Wolf's principal investor, slave trade merchant. 17 years later, Livingston became the founder of Queens College, the school that would eventually be named for another son of a slave-owning family, Henry Rutgers. The first president of the college, Jacob Hardenberg, and its first tutor, Frederick Frelinghuysen, were also slave owners. Rutgers' connection to slavery was neither casual, nor accidental, nor unusual. Like most early American colleges, Rutgers depended on slaves to build its campuses and serve its students and faculty. It depended on the sale of black people to fund its very existence. The faculty and curriculum at Rutgers and other early American colleges reinforced the theological and scientific racism that provided the ideological and spiritual justification for the free labor of Africans, the absolute power of slave owners, and the separation of the races. Through their leadership of the state and regional boards of the American Colonization Society, men like John Henry Livingston, who was Rutgers president from 1810 to 1824, the Reverend Philip Millerdoler, who was president of Rutgers from 1824 to 1840, Henry Rutgers, trustee after whom the college is named, and Theodore Frelinghuysen, Rutgers' 7th president. They were among the most ardent anti-abolitionists in the Mid-Atlantic, defending the American Colonization Society's position that free blacks, as I noted, were better off colonizing and Christianizing Africa than becoming full-fledged citizens of the United States. Frelinghuysen, a passionate defender of Native American rights to their southeastern lands, proclaimed African Americans to be, quote, a depressed and separate race. 2016 marked the 250th anniversary of the founding of Rutgers University, and that was thought to be an appropriate time to do what other schools were doing, reconcile with its connection to enslavement and the debasement of African Americans, and the disfranchisement and elimination of Native American people and culture. The project was initiated after a meeting of African American students met with the then Chancellor, Richard Edwards. After speaking with them about their feelings of alienation on the campus, the Chancellor asked me if I would chair a committee which was given the unwieldy title, quote, the Committee on the Enslaved and Disenfranchised Populations in Rutgers History. And it met throughout the spring of 2016. The committee undertook this work with the understanding that researching the history, this particular kind of history, is difficult and time-consuming because of the nature of 16th and 17th century historical sources. You know, it's not like you can go to Wikipedia. It's really difficult, particularly having to just find the documents and then trying to decipher what's being said in the handwriting of the time is difficult, but it's not impossible. The committee also began this work with the understanding that its initial findings would be presented in November of 2016. Remember, I got the charge in December of 2015. All right. We said we would do it, or at least I said we could do it. But that the work of unveiling the long and involved history of blacks and Native Americans at Rutgers would take a much longer time to complete. All right. The work on Rutgers' connection to slavery was a university-wide effort. Would you pass me the book? I do have some show and tell. This is the book that came out of our initial research. It was, as I said, a university-wide effort involving archivists, librarians, graduate students, undergraduates, my fellow professors, and the Rutgers University Press. A team of graduate students from the history department worked closely with myself and my colleague and co-editor, Professor Marissa Fuentes, the department's colonialist, Professor Camilla Townsend, who is the department's Native American specialist, and Thomas Frusciano, the university's archivist. Because of the connection between the Dutch Reformed Church and the founding of Rutgers, they also worked closely with the librarians at the Sage Library of the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. The New Brunswick Theological Seminary was the original Rutgers, actually, because Rutgers was formed out of the seminary. They divided into 3 subgroups. One group worked on the trustees and founders of Rutgers, and they located wills and inventories that indicate who owned which slaves. We have the name of some of the enslaved who built Old Queens and how much their masters were paid for their labor. There are a number of other details, but the bottom line is that by November 16th, we had enough information to write a book of essays about the slave ownership of Rutgers' founding fathers, and here it is in the flesh. From their wills, we discerned how the university founders bequeathed the human beings they owned. We also found some very interesting relationships between white slave owners and black female slaves. That be obviously because they left an inordinate amount of property to some of their female slaves. Another group of researchers unpacked what the New Brunswick African American community looked like. We have the minutes of the African American Association that met in New Brunswick. We figured that many of the slaves would more than likely lived in New Brunswick. We wanted to know what their lives were like. We know that its members were both enslaved and free, and that the masters of the enslaved paid their slaves membership dues. These minutes helped reveal the social and political life of New Brunswick's black population. The final group of researchers worked on the founders' thoughts about slavery. Many of the founders were active in the American Colonization Society, which, as I said, sought to send free blacks back to Africa. On the Native American front, Professor Townsend's undergraduate seminar, 25 undergraduate students, worked on the Lenape people. By the founding of the university, the Lenape had already lost possession of land that Rutgers is built upon, but the students nevertheless researched and wrote papers on, among other things, the social and cultural lives of the Lenape people, the displacement of Native Americans in the New Brunswick area during the 17th century, their participation in the debate over the Indian removal that took place in the 1820s and 1830s, and the way New Brunswick area residents romanticized Native Americans. Professor Townsend wrote the article, but gave credit to her undergraduates who did the research. Another graduate student tracked down information about how the Indian lands in the western United States got transferred to Rutgers with the Morrill Land Grant Acts of the 1860s, making Rutgers not an Ivy League school, but a state university. And our research was very well received and welcome. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that we rolled out this book and everybody in the audience was given a free book, but the audience was over 1,000 people. And it turns out that it was on November 18th, and all I need to tell you, November 18th of 2016. And so if that rings a bell, you know why we had so many people there. Okay. In October of last year, the university named the newest dormitory complex the Sojourner Truth Apartments. And it named the entry walkway to Old Queens, the first building at Rutgers, which currently houses the president's and the chancellor's offices, Will's Way. It was our research that discovered that Sojourner Truth, the abolitionist and feminist, was owned by the family of Jacob Hardenberg, Rutgers' first president. And we also found a receipt that paid the owner of a slave named Will for Will's masonry work on Old Queens. The public presentation of our work on campus and in the New Brunswick community and the dedication ceremonies of these two landmarks have helped Rutgers begin the process of acknowledging its history and reconciling with it. Along with the book, again, it's been very well received both within and outside the community of Rutgers. We have integrated the new knowledge into Rutgers visitors tours. And our undergraduates have developed, and our undergraduates in our public history courses have developed a separate tour for school and community groups that want to delve more deeply into this history. We are also building a website that will be updated continuously, as will our digital tour. Both, we have a physical and a digital, virtual tour. We have 2 more phases of the research to complete, and through our public presentations and publications, we hope to continue Rutgers' reconciliation with its past. The second phase, which researches the history of Rutgers and African Americans from the late 19th century through World War II, is complete. The chapters have been written, and we are now editing this volume that traces the entry of the first Black American students at Rutgers and the New Jersey College for Women, which subsequently in 1955 became Douglass College. Rutgers' role in the creation and dissemination of scientific racism that undergirded Jim Crow is covered in this book, as well as the social and political and economic nature of New Brunswick's African American community. This year, Douglass College, formerly the Women's College of Rutgers, is celebrating its centennial anniversary, and we are currently doing the research that will allow African American women to be fully incorporated into Douglass's history and celebration. The third phase of the research, which will feature the freedom struggle on Rutgers campuses, many campuses, will take the history of African Americans at Rutgers from World War II through the freedom movement to the present. And that research is now underway. In concluding, it's important to note that the Committee on the Disenfranchised, I can never get this committee right, even though I am the chair. The Committee on the Disenfranchised and Enslaved Populations in Rutgers History, it's important to note that this committee included a list of recommendations at the end of our first volume of Scarlet and Black, and it's in the epilogue. Many of the recommendations have been implemented and are in the process of being implemented, including, as I noted, the publication of a more complete history of African Americans at Rutgers, the establishment of physical and virtual tours, the creation of a digital tour and a digital website, the establishment of retention scholarships. At first I thought that that was never going to come to fruition, but I understand from our Vice Chancellor that the first of these has been initiated and actually granted. The appointment of a postdoctoral fellow to help with the administration of the project. This was all part of the institutionalization of the project, so it just wouldn't be sort of a fly-by-night. If we're going to have a digital presence, we definitely have to have somebody who is always going to be there and who's always going to be updating our websites. Also the allocation of funds to promote the annual New Jersey Native American Folk Festival, that has happened, and it has brought Rutgers University much closer to those Native American organizations in the area. The naming of new buildings, that was another thing that we wanted to see happen. One of the most important recommendations that has not been implemented is the creation of a diversity course requirement. In this regard, it is also important to note, and I'll talk about this later maybe in the question and answer period, that when Rutgers created the committee on the you-know-what, the disenfranchised and enslaved populations in Rutgers history, it also created another committee on diversity and inclusion. That committee issued a different report with some of the same recommendations, but also the report was more comprehensive and extensive. For example, they asked for a center of African American studies. I welcome this division of labor because I also must note that as of this date, the Scarlet and Black Project has received much more press, and more of its recommendations have been acted upon than the recommendations of the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. I mention this division of labor because I believe it was strategic, and I think it was important. It was important to me because there's no way that I could do both. In some ways, they are different charges, very different charges. And I'm a historian, and that's what I do best. For sure, had my committee been charged with handling both tasks, it would have made, I don't think it would have made as much progress as it's been made. Overall, I'm pleased with how the project has progressed. We've accomplished our aims because our administration was willing to provide all the support needed to complete this project. In other words, it came out to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they have put their money where their mouth was. And I can't, my department and colleagues were equally supportive. They came to me and said, "Can I help?" I encountered no opposition, and I can say, having been a member of the university consortium, that that's not the case across the country. If anything, I was the one who initially had doubts. I'm not a young spring chicken. I've been several times, and sometimes you can be put on a merry-go-round, and all you're doing is going around and around and not getting anything done. So initially, I was concerned that you're going to say you want to do stuff, and you're not going to put your money where your mouth is. That did not happen. So the university was and is committed to the project, and that has been a key to its success. Thanks.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I think it's always good when one puts the money in the mouth when they're in alignment. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here. I want to say thank you to Stephanie, to Nadine, and to Karen for providing all the logistics and organizing this event and having and giving us the opportunity to share with you, to President Burrows for charging the working group with the responsibility of thinking through some of these important issues that are affecting not only Holy Cross, but also, as Professor White has indicated, institutions of higher education across the country. What I would like to do in the time given to me for my remarks is to, one, sort of situate the work that I've been doing at Georgetown, at first in the context of this broader conversation and sort of what's at stake in these conversations, to then think about the work that me and my co-editors did in the Psyche Hold of Slavery and how that really relates to what I think are some of the salient issues that arose in the committees at Holy Cross, the responses that the committee was receiving in the survey that it sent out with regard to name changing specifically, although I do think that those responses speak to some of these broader issues, and then to talk very specifically about what Georgetown has done, not only in regards to its slavery memory and reconciliation group, of which I actually was not a part of, but I was a part of and the co-chair of the racial justice working group, which ended up subsuming the work of the of the slavery reconciliation group, because our work continued after their charge was completed. The title of this event today, particularly Accounting for History, provides an entry point to an important discussion and also a call to action. On the one hand, it raises the question of how do we take into account the ways that slavery in particular and the legacies of disenfranchisement more broadly inform the contemporary and future goals of the university. The question itself then turns attention to not only how institutional memory, or as Toni Morrison might say, rememory, intrudes into the present, but it also asks how we respond to this call. This response takes us to the other hand of accounting, which moves beyond the philosophical or reflective mode to question more substantively in what material ways can an institution, and here the College of Holy Cross, reckon with its past, the legacies of privilege and disadvantage that the past engendered. As the report from the working group suggests, the inability to reach a consensus on whether to change the name of Healy Hall turns attention to structural, philosophical, material, and cultural debates that, while originating in past behaviors, very much inform the present moment. In 2016, I co-edited the Psychic Hold of Slavery, Legacies in American Expressive Culture. In this volume, the contributors and I wanted to explore not only the material legacies of slavery, but how it's denied, but real continued present, haunts the American psyche. Specifically, the co-editors and I and the participants had two questions at mind. The first was, why can't black people get over slavery? The second, why would they want to? In the first question, it turned our attention to the way that slavery is often thought of as a black problem and not an American one. And in thinking about one of the responses to the questions that the working group had, one of your faculty members thought it was important to note that slavery's legacies, quote, are inescapably built into the fabric of our society, end quote. The idea in the first question sort of also suggested that if people stopped talking about, writing about, thinking about, discussing, or representing slavery and its legacies, both would disappear. The will to deny slavery's ongoing significance turned attention precisely to its salience. The second question, why would they want to, raises questions about what it would mean to get over slavery, is it possible to get over slavery, and what types of changes and actions would need to happen in order to make this possible if it were a desired goal. In reading the committee's report from the working group, I am struck by how the question that this volume raises in its examinations of black cultural production resonates in the responses that the faculty, staff, alumni, and current students gave regarding their feelings about changing or not the name of Healy Hall. What does it mean, for example, to explain someone's behavior as primarily being a product of his or her time? How does the racial identity of respondents inform their reactions to renaming? Does changing a building's name erase a history, particularly a history that may not be well known to begin with? Does changing a building's name mark a turning point toward the future mission of a university that has not lived up to its ideals but desires to make better on promises moving forward? This issue of moving forward becomes increasingly more urgent when we consider the committee had a task to, quote, review our history in relation to our identity and mission. The mission statement notes, how do we find meaning in life and history? What are our obligations to one another? What is our special responsibility to the world's poor and powerless, end quote. Georgetown University offers an important entry point for us to think about these issues further, and Georgetown's efforts to account for race and slavery here looms large in these discussions. Even one of the respondents to the survey from Holy Cross noted Georgetown, admonishing the committee to, quote, please avoid Georgetown's banal renaming of Mileti and McSherry as Freedom and Remembrance Halls, end quote. In 2015, I had the opportunity to sit in on a conference call with the president of the university and other administrators in that unit to discuss whether or not they should rename, should the president's office take unilateral moves to rename McSherry and Mileti Halls because of the histories that have been referenced for you already today. It was the opinion of the faculty on that call that perhaps we should move to rename these halls. The president, who is very much invested, and understandably so, in faculty governance and consensus, wanted to instead defer this decision to the working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. And so, as is sometimes the case at universities, the students' ideas at Georgetown of how fast this decision should be moving and how fast the working group was moving were not in alignment. At the same time that this was happening, these histories were being uncovered at all kinds of universities and institutions. And so it was happening at Yale, but more publicly was in Missouri. And in Missouri in particular, part of what the student activism raised there was sort of broader infrastructural and institutional issues that these names were only symptomatic of. And so what the students at Georgetown did was they organized and they had a sit-in on the outside of the president's office. And part of what they were sitting in for was until they changed the name. So they changed the name of the residence hall. And so this started maybe about 1 o'clock on a Friday. The students had asked if the name had not been changed by Monday morning, could we host class outside of the president's office? I said, sure. And but interestingly enough, by 5 or 7 o'clock that evening, we were getting an email indicating that the names were being changed. And so the student activism, we could say, helped to speed up the process. But part of what that conversation helped me to think about, and I think it helped the faculty more generally to think about, was sort of two related issues. If we know about the formation of Africana or African American studies as a discipline, we know that in the late 1960s and related to the civil rights, black power, and black feminist movements, the students, San Francisco State goes on strike, and the students sort of occupied these buildings, and it's sort of one of the beginnings of ethnic studies. And so part of what we know at Georgetown, which is not untrue at a lot of institutions of higher education, that student activism sometimes moves the needle forward faster than the faculty governance committees. But more importantly, there was actually some sophisticated connections sort of being made at Georgetown that were important. And one of which was sort of the marginalization of African American studies. We could think of as a discipline. We could think of black students' experiences are related to an anti-black racism that is not disconnected from slavery, even if people don't want to make necessarily a causal connection. And so part of what people tried to think about and to make the case for was sort of how does this larger history of anti-black racism inform what happens and what is not happening at the university. So this happens simultaneously. So some of the consequences of this activism are as follows. So for one, the residence halls, Maletti and McSherry, for the interim were renamed Freedom Hall and Remembrance Hall until the Working Group on Slavery, Memory, and Reconciliation could continue doing its work to find out a more appropriate name for those halls. And so in 2017, the halls, there was an official liturgy and a contrition ceremony where the university issued an apology for the sale of the 272 enslaved Africans, and also changed the names to Isaac Dawkins Hall and Isaac Hawkins and Anne Marie Beecraft. Isaac Hawkins, his name was one of the first names that appeared on the register of the bill of sale and the documents drawn up by Father Maletti, and Anne Marie Beecraft was an activist and educator who opened up one of the first all-black girls' school in Washington, D.C. And so that committee felt as though that would be an appropriate gesture in terms of renaming those halls. In addition to that, Georgetown has taken it upon itself to establish relationships with descendants of the 272, two of whom are current students at Georgetown. If my memory is correct, I believe they both should be in their second years at Georgetown University. In addition to that, Georgetown has gone to have meetings in Louisiana. So it's sort of having these descendants become a part of the Georgetown community, having Georgetown go and be a part of their community. Some issues have arisen, though, in that process, which sort of has to do with the reconciliation group made a recommendation around admissions, and it was to give the descendants whatever other kind of advantages in admission that you would give other people. So, for example, if there's legacy in terms of, if there's a legacy admission, whatever that preferential thing is, to make sure they got that too. The other recommendation that the report said was there should be some financial, something that goes, it's not free to go to Georgetown, and that they might want to account for that as well. That recommendation was not adopted as quickly. And so I think that my understanding is that the university and the descendants are in some energetic conversation about the timeline for when that would happen and what other venues could be explored if that were not necessarily to happen. In addition to the things that, some of the issues that Professor Gray raised, which include the website, they also proposed a center for the study of slavery and its legacies. And that became an important entry point for sort of where the group I was on, the Racial Justice Working Group, came into play. And so let me just say something or a few things about what the Racial Justice Working Group has sort of accomplished too, and what it is looking at as well. Part of what has been important at Georgetown, and I think that President DeJoy is very much committed to this, and I think that there are also pockets of faculty and students who are helping him to be committed to this as well, has been to answer questions that include, what commitments do we want to make to the future, right? So it's about the past, it's about the present, but it's also who Georgetown wants to be in the future. What resources do we want to devote to fulfilling those commitments? So we understand that symbolic gestures are important because they do have material consequences, but we also understand that material consequences also have consequences, so we want to think about what those mean. What does it mean to acknowledge history and give a sustained commitment to it, and what strategies are we to employ? Part of Georgetown's mission, which is not unlike Holy Cross's, is committed to social justice, and that we train our students to be men and women for others. And so what does it mean to be men and women for others? So some of the reforms that have happened is that the Racial Justice Working Group was instrumental in getting the Department of African American Studies formed, of which I'm the inaugural chair, and which is entering to its third year. That very same year, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Executive Council voted to make African American Studies a major as opposed to it being an interdisciplinary minor. Now, these are important institutional commitments for several reasons. First of all, departments, as you may be well aware, they have a lot more, it's not resources just in terms of faculty and staff, but sort of institutional power. Because now there's a tenure granting the body, which means it can make hiring decisions, right? It can sustain its own curriculum in ways that when we were in interdisciplinary programs, we were, in many respects, depending on the kindness of strangers, so to speak. And so it gives a level of autonomy, and that's long-term commitment in terms of what it means to commit to a salary or salary lines. And so we have, in the past 3 years, we have hired 3 tenure track or tenured professors in the department itself, and we also are in this current academic year, we're hiring, and I moved my line from English to be 100% in the Department of African American Studies, and this year English is hiring, which means there's sort of been a commitment to replace the loss that happened at that movement in that place too. The Racial Justice Committee also recommended the formation of a Racial Justice Institute, which would sort of situate Georgetown in the forefront of studying racial justice, not only as it relates to slavery, but as it relates to other forms of disenfranchisement. I think there's been much discussion about if that's going to be localized to, not discussion about this. Georgetown wants to better serve the community of Washington, D.C., okay? And so Georgetown it's isolated, it's in a very, the demographics of Georgetown and the demographics of Washington, D.C. are not the same, although if that could be not true in a couple of years too. And so that is one of the, so that was an important recommendation, that was an important commitment. So that institute is currently in the process of searching for senior faculty members. And so the idea is that people would be appointed as researchers in the center, and they would also have a tenure line appointment in the department. So in African American Studies, we're partnering with Performing Arts, but the Law Center, the Medical School, and the McCourt School of Public Policy, all of us are conducting those searches. They're targeted, they'll be advertised, but part of what we had to do in the meantime was we don't actually have a physical space for the center, but this is a university priority and initiative. So we've begun a lecture series, and we're inviting people to talk through and around these issues. And so we had Carol Anderson last year, and we have, and I believe she's coming back this year for something else, but it was related to it. We sought external funding, and so we were the recipients of a Mellon grant. What the Mellon grant did was it helped pay for the salaries of some of these tenure line assistant professors. It helped to fund the lecture series. It also, that lets me know I'm almost in negative time, but I gave myself 2 extra minutes, so I got 2 minutes for your warning. So I stopped it short. And so that grant also paid for postdoctoral fellows who were not in the Department of African American Studies, but who were, one last year was in history, so it was particularly studying these issues around Georgetown's relationship to slavery. This year, I believe that the provost's office actually absorbed the cost for one of these postdocs, and so we took a different postdoc who's in the Department of Theology, who's exploring these issues from another perspective. And so there are external funding, there's internal funding, there's funding that the president's raising, there's funding that the deans are raising, and the provost. And so it is an all, I think it's an all hands on deck situation at Georgetown. I think that part of that is because President DeJoy has made it clear that this is what his commitments are, and I think that if everybody still wants to be part of the Georgetown family, they understand that they have to make those commitments too. And so I think that I wouldn't say that, there has been resistance, but I also think there has been questions. I think that these issues become particularly complicated where, if there's only going to be X amount of tenure lines, for example, now you have somebody else vying for tenure lines. But I do think there's all kind of ways to do this excitingly. Tenure is the property of a university, not a department. So it's not always clear to me why tenure lines have to be in departments. So that seems like it would give universities all type of flexibility in terms of how to sustain its faculty and staff long term, but not necessarily binding it to some of the other costs that departments incur. And so I think there's all kind of ways to do that without replicating separate but equal at the same time. So those are my remarks. Thank you, and I look forward to our conversation.
All right, is this on or off? Can you hear me? I'm usually pretty loud, so it's easy.
And we should also say there's a microphone in the middle for questions when we open it up to the audience, because we are filming this to keep a record for our own learning.
So I'm going to start off with a few questions for Professors White and Patterson. I'm so excited by the great turnout we've had for this and by their fantastic remarks. So I'm going to try and keep my questions short because we very much hope that you in the audience, you in our community, have questions for them as well. But I thought I would start off by asking you to just reiterate one more time, because this is something that I think people need to hear more than once. Robert, you had touched on it a little bit in talking about some of the anonymous replies we had gotten when our first working group had put out a survey, and generally the sense of why do we have to dredge up this history? It's so unpleasant. Why aren't we past this now? And I think that we saw a lot of pushback when our campus started looking into the Milady and the Healy issues about sort of well, he was just a product of his time, or, we shouldn't judge him by his actions at Georgetown compared to all of the good that he did for us at Holy Cross and kept Holy Cross afloat. And so generally I think there's a lot of sense still that, it's unfair to cast a 21st century lens on these historical figures, and that it's somehow inappropriate or stirring up trouble. So, and maybe particularly for you, Professor White, as a historian, how can we better explain what it is that we do when we are trying to examine these historical actions and historical narratives?
You go first this
So
time.
one of the issues here, I do think that this conversation, well, first of all, let me just say this. I have wondered increasingly more how historians in 50 years are going to write about this present moment, right? And where people were silent, where people were not silent, and sort of what it meant to be a product of one's time. Because I do think that although slavery was the law of the land, I do think that there were also people of that time who were not participating in the exchange of human chattel. But I do think that there's two issues at stake here. If we talk about diversity and inclusion, and inclusion is the key part. So it's not just about the presence of having bodies, but more thinking about how is it that the culture of the institution is receptive to making that a hospitable place, and to diminishing microaggressions, any other thing that might be related to making it not, then it's not just something of the past. The past seems always present, right? And I do think that there's something about, why is it that we can't, and when I've had these conversations, it's not about those conversations actually don't want to even acknowledge that this was an issue, right? And so there's something about, as I was saying, about that will to deny that has larger implications about, this is not about simply recounting a narrative. This is sort of thinking about looking collectively at what it is that we value as an institution. As institutions, we make determinations about what we value all the time. We have a core curriculum at Georgetown. We have decided that students should know X, Y, and Z, right? And we make a determination in that respect. And so that's what I would sort of say is that it's very much a part of the presence. And we actually did get the diversity requirement, which was, I didn't name that, but we have a 2-course, different classes can satisfy it, global and domestic. But to sort of think about what is it that we're trying to do and how do some of the things we uphold implicitly or explicitly undermine those goals.
Thank you. So, first of all, I think we've really never reconciled the contradictions of slavery and freedom in this nation, and that's something that we really ought to think about. And we need to understand that American freedoms, the freedoms that we acknowledge are the foundation of this country, those freedoms that are outlined in the Bill of Rights and in the Constitution of the United States. American freedom, as one of our preeminent historians have noted, is based on American slavery.
Right.
Some people could be free and have the kind of liberty that they had because other people were slaves.
Right.
And that's really essential for one to understand. In fact, we are now beginning to think about slavery and not talk about, we can talk about emancipation in 1865. I mean, when I say we us historians. But what was ushered in 1865 with the 13th Amendment was not freedom.
Right.
So if we never understand what slavery was, what happened in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, there are people who are calling, the reign of the KKK, the lynching that took place afterwards, the separation of the races, as worse than slavery. We have books on this. There are films of slavery by another name.
Right.
So right now, we are in the midst of revising our thoughts just even about slavery and what that is. So slavery was outlawed by law with the 13th Amendment, obviously, and definitely by the 14th Amendment, certainly. But, but grandfather clauses that came in that disallowed people from voting, the lynching of African Americans that took place between 1880 and all the way through the 1950s, the separation of the races, the disenfranchisement, the denial of education, et cetera, et cetera. Are we really going to call that freedom? So you say, well, can't you get over slavery? Maybe what we are looking at now with the killing of African American men and women in the streets by what some people might call a state lynching by the police, but maybe that's just another form of slavery. And that, I think, is really important to note. And then just one more comment: we can't judge these 17th and 18th century people on 21st century standards. Let's understand it. The Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. There was no other democracy on the planet, and yet he envisioned it. And what we call him a hero for that. This was a man who was not of his time, who thought beyond his time. In Notes of Virginia, he talks about African Americans as being a different species. So no, I disagree. We need to judge. It's not as if the people of that generation of the 18th and 19th century did not know what rape was. And when they said it is not a law, it is not against the law to rape a black woman, it's not that they didn't know what rape was, and we can't judge them by today's standards. It was immoral then, and it is immoral now. So this notion that we're judging one generation by another generation's standards, I have to say, as a historian and just as a human being, that's totally garbage.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think actually kind of along those same lines about narrative and reception, somewhat relatedly, and this had come up with, again, the really sort of amazing and kind of heartening response that everybody wanted to get this book in November 2016. It suddenly seemed super relevant again. And the welcome that you said, it was sort of really, really welcome, and people were really excited about it. I think often institutions tend to think of their alumni as a monolith, and of course we're here and as everywhere else, we're very proud of our alumni. We're also very reliant on them for their sort of financial support for, infrastructure and mission. Change is very hard for some alumni, I think, and we've definitely at Holy Cross have experienced that in recent years with discussions on everything from changing our logo to retiring our mascot and issues around the Crusader. So can you speak a little bit more for us about sort of how you deal with alumni pushback or how it's sort of arisen at your institutions or not? And what have you found that works as effective outreach, particularly to alumni, particularly to those who aren't on campus every day for discussions like this or aren't getting this, in their classrooms?
Well, I'll just leave it. I'll start and then, but I have to say that we haven't gotten pushback. And I'm not sure why, or at least if there's pushback, it hasn't been, I haven't experienced it or felt it. I think the university, and now as I said, they did something that I think was very strategic. All right, so there's scarlet and black, and there's everything you can do with this, and then there's the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity. So, when it comes, the other thing is that we're dealing with a large state public institution. Right. And as a state university, there are things that are mandated by the state and by the people of the state, whether or not they send their children to Rutgers or not. And we're dealing with apples and oranges when we're looking at Georgetown, as opposed to the state university. But there has been really a lot of positive feedback with this.
So one of the so getting in line with the university, with the president's vision, I think has been helpful with with advancement. But there's actually a couple things that are more broad trends that I think are true, which has to do with who's listening to whom and where the alumni are, right? So one of the things that struck me in that report for one of the comments that I shared with you all was that I believe that the alumni was in the class of 62 as self-identified. And so it made me think of what Holy Cross looked like in 1962, particularly if part of this renaming of the Healy Hall had to do with someone integrating, right, in terms of race and gender, then that sort of gave me an idea. Look, alumni populations have changing demographics. And I think that the question becomes, how are we going to respond to this relationship, literally again, between the past, the present, and the future? And is it, at some point, presumably, the alumni groups that we're targeting are going to look demographically different, right? So the alumni from Holy Cross from the 80s, from the 90s, presumably into the 21st century, may look very differently than it did from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And so part of what seems important is making this balance between making short-term decisions that ultimately in the long term will alienate what the changing demographic looks like, as opposed to not necessarily doing that. And so it seems to me that part of what advancement does is it has affinity groups, it has all these different points of entry of where to sort of push this message to. So much to my, I wouldn't say, well, this is tape, right? So anyway, much to my experience, I am now a faculty representative on the Georgetown University Alumni Association, and one of the, which just got a new executive director, which just got a new president, and that association works very closely with advancement. And so at our fall leadership weekend, everybody was there in place pushing the same message, right? This is what Georgetown's priority is. How do we achieve that? So the Alumni Association just formalized a diversity and inclusion group. The vice president from advancement talked about how this racial justice and African American studies are fitting into the next capital campaign. And so it seems to be the case that, at least publicly, the messaging seems to be working similarly. It is, when people at least see me in person, it would also be interesting if they actually gave me the pushback. So I do think that my demographics might make it. Isn't that such a shame? African American Studies in the department now? Yeah. I don't think somebody necessarily say that to me directly, but that could be the case too.
Yeah, the anonymous email is always easier for sure.
Exactly, right? So.
Great, and then and I do want us to have questions from the community. So my last one I think will be short and sweet, I hope. So I appreciated that. I think what came clearly through in both of your talks is, as you said, put our money where our mouths are in terms of moving forward, to kind of move from to action items and to better marry rhetoric with action as we move forward. So as we think about ways to move forward, what's the number one mistake to avoid, would you advise us for, as we hopefully get more money behind this?
I say this about people, and I'll say this about, and I think it applies to institutions, and my friends laugh when I say this. People are limited by their limitations, which is to say that because an institution has been doing something X, Y, and Z way, doesn't bind it to that. And so one of the things about so part of what we had to do when we were putting forth the proposal to make African American Studies a major, we did not know that it was going to become a department. So we were making that stride without this. And so the whole language of the university, is that cost neutrality, right? It needs to be cost neutral. So we put forth a major that was cost neutral. So that if, in fact, if we didn't become a department, and at that point, it was some conversation about it, but I didn't think that was what was about to happen. But if that were the case, how could this major function and be sustainable with the resources that we had? So part of what that included was, having 2 required courses in AFAM, and then everything else could be accomplished through cross-listing, as it were. We opted at that current time not to have an honors thesis option, because we did not have the capacity to support that. Well, one of the agenda items for the undergraduate curriculum committee now is how should that now look, given what we now have and where we're going in terms of the future. So it's basically to say it's a sort of this propensities, I think sometimes, and this is because how sometimes the way academics are trained, is to critique and criticize, et cetera, and to deconstruct. But at some point, it's sort of what can you accomplish with what you have in the existing resources. So I not enough of what you can't do, what can you do? Mm-hmm. And sort of having that kind of visionary thing. And so these are what the resources are. And then to think about, well, what resources do we have? Because I will also say, relatedly, there's money for what there's money for. Right? There's never any money except for when there is. Mm-hmm. Right? And so we get it. There's different pools of money for this, but there's also money for what there's money for.
And I would echo that. I have the same thing written down. Restrict your vision to what can be accomplished with the resources that you have. You can always expand once you decide. I mean, we started out with the notion, or at least I was charged with, doing just the book. And the chancellor said, I want a book. And I'm like, and you want it by November, 8 months from now? We haven't even begun. He said, no matter what it takes. And so we started with just the book. It has now expanded into a major university project. But when I decided, all right, I know how we can do it, and I said to him, this is going to cost. He said, I want the book. I said, all right. And I'm like, well, how are you going to get it published? I'll take care of that. But Rutgers has the Rutgers University Press.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing that, you have that resource. It's connected to the university. We expanded and grew, it sort of mushroomed from there. But even now, as people want to do this and they want to do that, I'm very specific in terms of making sure that the kinds of things that I say the Scarlet and Black Project can do, that we actually have the resources to do them.
Right.
I did not, we thought, it was suggested that we go for outside funding. And my feeling was, if this university wants this, then this university,
Right.
first of all, they will write the grant, because I was not going to do the grant writing, but that if the university wanted it, then they would provide the funds for it.
Right.
And they did. And let me just say, when I say that they provided the funds for it, so we had 13 graduate students that worked for 6 months, or 5 to 6 months, at $20 an hour. Okay, that's a pocket full of change. When I asked them for a postdoc for the next couple of volumes, a postdoc is at $75,000 a year plus benefits. That's $100,000 per person. They came up with that. They've come up with enough money to pay graduate students at $20 an hour for 3 years. That's a whole lot of money. They wanted it. They got it.
Right. Can I add something? And to your point, right, the Provost's office wrote that Mellon grant because I echo what you say in terms of one of the other things about some of these issues is that what the coalition looks like. But let me say something too about this whole major, minor, department, and limit by limitation. So universities are interesting because part of how you demonstrate interest is through numbers. But it's hard to get numbers with limited resources. And so it becomes this interesting, chicken before the egg. Well, if you have to demonstrate the interest, right, in order to expand. But at some point, that is irrelevant because it's about what the institution's commitments are. And also, you can't have a history of being inequitable and then try to use the same metrics to make a determination. So you can't say, oh, if there were more, it would be challenging to say, yeah, I guess you could say this, but it would be not as wise to say, Africana Studies needs to demonstrate more students are interested. If you demonstrate more students are interested in, then we could consider maybe having a conversation, forming a committee about developing a major, right? Because it would be hard to track because if you don't have classes that are specific for Africana Studies, then you can't tell if 5 of those English students were out. You can't make those determinations. And so the numbers game becomes exactly that when you have those histories too. So that's another metric that can't over-determine the future of a unit.
Great.
Let's open it up.
Yeah, and I think definitely now, if there's anyone in the community who'd like to ask questions, please give the mic.
And can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Clara Gibson. I was really excited to see Georgetown on the list because I actually grew up in D.C. So at DC, and I know specifically, you, Professor, were talking about New Brunswick, but Rutgers also has a Camden campus that recently opened up. And DC and Camden are specifically 2 instances of these prestigious institutions with a lot of capital behind them that are situated in the middle of cities that don't match their demographics. So how, I guess my question is, how does your work on reconciling the past of racial injustices and institutionalized racism in these institutions connect with trying to form a connection to the communities these colleges are situated in? There's been a big history of activism in colleges, obviously. Recently, the Uncoke campus movement at George Mason and the sit-ins at Howard. So obviously it's something that's of interest. But have you come across that in either the students or in yourselves, that element of present-day racial and economic struggles for equality connected with the past?
At Rutgers, Rutgers, you're right, there's a New Brunswick campus, there's a Newark campus, and then there's the Camden campus. So far, most of our research has been on the New Brunswick campus, but as we expanded with Volume 2 into the New Jersey College for Women, because the Women's College was not founded until 1918, I think, something like that. Yeah, 1918. So with the third volume, we will be going much more into Camden and Newark, and particularly Newark, because the freedom struggle, particularly Newark, was almost lily white, but it was in a community which was and located right smack dab in the black community. And now, which is really interesting, because it's like right now, if you live long enough, you see, issues come up, and you have to start to say to yourself, particularly as college students, and who most of you are 18 or 19 years old, you need to say, well, what is this going to look like in 20, 30 years? Mm-hmm. And am I going to be on the right side of history? Mm-hmm. So now, Newark is Rutgers boasts Newark as the most, and it has been labeled this by U.S. News and World Report, the most diverse community, the most diverse university in the country. And it is so proud of that. It has a business school, it has a law school, it has a medical school, and across all of them, including the undergraduate school, it is the most diverse. But it wasn't in the 1950s. So it was, some of the research that we're doing, if you look at the freedom struggle on Newark's campus in the 1950s in the 1960s, and Mason Gross, who was the president at the time, they said he caved in to student protests, right? Because there were sit-ins and there were demonstrations, etc. And you should see the hate mail that this man got. We have the letters, and our students, our researchers are going through them. Oh, you for lack of a better, you're such a pea person, and you're this, and I would have taken a shotgun to all of these people. Now, Rutgers is so proud, and they actually are celebrating the Corwin Hall. They're now celebrating that sit-in, and they're going to do that in 19. Next year, in 2019, they're having the centennial of Paul Robeson. Now Paul Robeson is like, oh, he's our first, he was a football hero, etc. When he was there, when he first went out onto that football field, his own teammates tried to kill him. They broke his ribs. They did every single thing. Now Rutgers is on in one. They were playing Washington and Lee at one point, and they would not let him take the field because, as a Southern Virginia school, they were like, we're not going to take the field if Robeson takes the field, because we're not playing against a college that has a black person on it, and they did not use the B word, they used the N word. All right, but now we're approaching the 100th centennial of Paul Robeson's graduation, and he graduated as a valedictorian. You know, this was when football players actually, I won't go there.
Right.
All right. I won't go there. But no, he was but what I'm trying to say in the end is that you want to be on the right side of history. One of the things that we are doing at Rutgers, we've given a lot of presentations in our community. And if you look in here, one of the things that we have in this book is a history of African Americans in New Brunswick, and we're going to do the same thing we do have an article in volume 2, so that the students, people who want to come on campus, if they want to, or just do a virtual tour, they can get the history of New Brunswick as well. We don't have an issue of, whether, or at least not yet, whether or not, like Columbia had, we are encroaching on their, areas. We're trying to do a town gown meshing. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? Go ahead. E, hop up. You got it.
Yeah, on the mic. Go.
Go,
No,
do
students
it.
first.
You go.
Thank you. Hi, thank you again for being here tonight. This is my question for Mr. Patterson, correct? You mentioned that Georgetown now offers classes concentrated on diversity and inclusion, correct me if I'm wrong, as a common area requirement?
So what it is that the students who I believe came in 16 or 17, they have to take 2 courses that satisfy global diversity and domestic diversity, but they're not additional classes. So, for example, this was sort of how, so the students initially, what they wanted was a course on diversity, for whatever that might have looked like. And then through our working groups and conversations, which was separate from this one right here, we sort of came to us understanding what is it that these courses should achieve. So we had the learning objectives and goals, and then went back and looked at existing courses and saw how could those courses do this. And so let's say you're taking a general education requirement. So let's say you're taking a general education requirement, which we have at Georgetown, the problem of God is one of those courses. And let's say this specific section is focused on black religious thought. Then that would satisfy your theology requirement. So it's called an overlay requirement in technical terms, right? And so yes, and so they have to take 2 of those. And so, yes.
Thank you. So my follow-up to that would be, what does that look like in the school, and what are comments from students that you've received? Do they like it? Do they feel satisfied? Do they feel like they're learning?
So what's interesting about it? I think that because of when this happened, right? So we're back in this 2015, and so the students, it was some more activism helped this, but what happened was the tide began to shift, because any curricular change has to go through the main campus executive faculty. And I remember this distinctly. I sat on that, and that particular day, not only did the vice provost of education show up on the day of the vote, but the provost also showed up. And so there was a general sense that sort of there's a level of cultural competence that the university feels like is as important as these 2 philosophy courses, these 2 theology courses, government, all the different core requirements that they have to take. And so I do think that the list of courses is probably, in some cases, more expansive than the students initially might have wanted. But for the most part, the courses on there, they satisfy, that requirement. And departments are sort of happy to help. I think the departments are increasingly happy to help fulfill requirements that students need, because it's sort of everyone can benefit from the requirement, because now they might take this course, but now they might take one of the other courses, and as these numbers inform resources, I think people are happy to see students come through their majors and their minors, and it also begins to, in some departments, attract students they have not seen. So you will hear students say, oh, we wish we had more fill-in-the-blank type of history honors students or English or whatever the case is. But through some of these requirements, they're seeing more of those students, so it seems to be beneficial in several respects, right? I mean, of course, there's students who don't want to take it, but they don't want to take anything, which also begs the question of why you're here. But anyway, again, right? But students get information on these requirements. There's requirements, right? And they actually seem to get something out of it. You're welcome.
Stephanie, do you have a question?
We have about 5 more minutes, so if you can
Okay.
hang out, that'd be
I'll
great.
be quick. My name is
No,
Stephanie,
you're
and I'm a faculty member here. I appreciate all of your comments, particularly the end of the question regarding sort of start where you are, propose solutions that are feasible. And it strikes me when we have this conversation, when we talk about reparations, both in the history of slavery and how we've treated Native American peoples and other indigenous peoples, it always strikes me as odd that there's there's not an easy solution, but there's at least one first start that costs nothing.
Right.
And it's a sincere, heartfelt apology and an acknowledgement of the wrongdoings that have been done.
Right.
And I don't mean to suggest that that is where, that conversation should stop, but it's a great starting point. And my mind is running with excitement at all of the concrete solutions that your institutions have implemented, and I look forward to the opportunity for us to imagine and engage in many of those. So my question for you is, of institutional presidents or administrators, or I know you mentioned there was a liturgy on the Georgetown campus, who has given the best apology? And if you don't think that exists, what would a good apology look like?
Yeah. So I think that it's easier. I'll answer the second question, which is what would it look like. So part of the issue with apologizing that I think is acknowledging specifically what happened and sort of not dancing around, right? And sort of hitting the nail on the head that, it's not one of those apologies. If you were offended by what I said, then, I hate to hear that. It's sort of say, I said X, Y, and Z. This is how it happened. It does not matter that the current officers at Georgetown, for an example, they did not do that. Right, so we know that, but it's not their fault, but it's their fight. It's sort of one way to think of it, and it's the cause you want to take up. I think you have to at least acknowledge dead on, in specific terms, what happened, right? That it was in fact wrong, and that you're, as you said, sincerely sorry for it, and that there is some future thing going forward. So there needs to be some gesticulation towards whatever that repair might be, right? Gesturing towards what that repair might be that may move past the symbolism. But there is something about the apology that's an acknowledgement that doesn't seem insignificant, because, when Congress in 2009 finally apologized for slavery, they had a little asterisk, and they said, but this cannot be used in any suit for reparations, right? And so there's the but. And so but a sincere apology cannot deny it, right? I did this, but stop. There's no but, period, no comma. And so that seems to be at least partial elements of it.
Here's what and that's a really good question, and I'm having a hard time with it. And I think that in order to apologize for something, you have to understand what happened. And I really just don't think that most Americans know what happened during slavery. They really don't know what happened. So in most cases, when you have like truth and reconciliations, and you have like they did in South Africa, or like you did after World War II with Germany, I think that all of the facts really need to be laid on the table first, so that we can really have an accounting of really what happened and the toll that it took. You have so many people who still believe, they will apologize for slavery, but they will nevertheless still think that, I think that your people really got off better with slavery or enjoyed. I mean, we had historians, you have the whole Dunning School of History that just said, black people were better off in slavery than they were. And you still have people than they would have been free, because they really, as a race, are a childish race, and they don't really know how to take care of themselves. So I really think that before we have an apology, which I think is a good place to start, one really does have to know. And just as an aside with that, I noticed, I don't know, how many of you watched The Handmaid's Tale? And what I find very peculiar about that is that in every single, they keep talking about this is the dystopian vision of society, dystopian. And I looked that word up. And I'm like, no, this actually happened in America. This actually happened. But we're so happy to talk about this as some sort of science fiction or some outlandish, unrealistic picture of reality that really couldn't happen, although it seems to be happening. Right. But this is a picture of what happened in America, where women were not in control of their reproductive organs, where people had to run away to Canada to be free. And despite all of the, where people were not allowed to read, this is all in The Handmaid's Tale. And I'm like, this is not dystopia. This is what happened. And so I think an apology is a good thing, but I want people to really have a sense of what slavery really was. Then you can make a decision as to whether or not emancipation really ended slavery or transformed it.
That's a great.
I'm sorry to end. That's
history.
Not an up.
Are you kidding? That's the best history. So I want to respect everybody's time because it's 6:00, and take a minute to thank our panelists and thank Nadine and Dennis Kennedy and Karen Todd. Oh, there you are, Karen, in the back. Karen for helping organize all of and she's like, don't call me out. People will look at me. But essential support from Karen Todd and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies and the Department of History as well. And I want to thank Phil Burrows for being here and for the committees that we've had and the work that's been done and the changes that have happened, and also for the commitment to and the inspiration, what's moving forward on these questions. And also, just by way of two things that's interesting, is that in 2 weekends, or is it next weekend, we're having a commemorative weekend celebrating the Black student walkout as well in 1968 here. And that's an interesting thing about how interpretations of the past change. And then the other thing too, and this is another occasion for this, is that this is the 175th anniversary of Holy Cross. And commemorative moments, you said this about Rutgers, are often moments where institutions pause and they reflect, and certainly in our Jesuit tradition of contemplation and discernment and being contemplatives in action, this question and other kinds of questions about the stories we tell about ourselves, who we aspire to be as a community, are really at the heart of what we do. So I'm really excited about what the President's Office and the Provost's Office are doing to move this forward. I'm really excited about what we've heard today. I'm also really interested, your question about common area requirements, super timely, because the faculty are taking this up and we're reviewing our common area requirements and thinking about what should a Holy Cross education look like for our students. Different from, because life is changing and demographics are changing and the world is changing from maybe what it looked like the last time we reviewed them. So there are a lot of ways into this conversation. And I am so thrilled I know it's like a midterms week, and to have all you students here engaged and thinking about these questions. And I guess my exit comment would be stay engaged. And when the President's Office and the Provost's Office put out a call, I can say, because we were on these committees, Nadine and I, sometimes we do these listening sessions and people didn't show up because they were busy. And it was so frustrating, because this is your institution. It's your history, it's our history, and it's more importantly, as you both point out, it's our future, right? Mm-hmm. So please stay engaged, please show up, please use your voice, and please be invested in us living out our commitments to these things. And also, please join me in thanking so much Deborah Gray White and Robert Patterson for sharing their